It doesn't mean that any or all of these projects would get off the ground, but we've used ArcGIS modelling and leapfrog modelling and various other things to demonstrate the volume and supply and what that might look like. We've also modelled in our region all the lowland wind potential, and we're talking flat and rolling country. We have very high lowland wind potential in Southland. The wind blows pretty well. We've also looked at 112 potential wind sites. It doesn't mean that, again, that all or any of these will be developed, but a lot of them are being considered at the moment. And so we've used international standards to model all of this, and we've created geospatial layers. This is a quick snapshot of that. So all of these can be picked up, or any one of these can be picked up with all the technical data to get the project done underway, including grid data and a whole range of other things. We've modelled every grid exit point, and we've modelled every sub-exit point, so we know what the forward demand on each of these points is and when we need to invest. And that's moving in a really positive way, in a different way to what we have in the past. So we're aiming to try and invest ahead of demand and put in place a mechanism, financial mechanism to manage that. We're also looking at solar. Yes, we have better solar than Germany, more than 1,000 kilowatts per square metre. In fact, the lowest is 1,275 kilowatts per square metre, but in some areas where you want to implement ACOT, avoided cost of capital, then having solar in Southland even works really, really well. So you can reduce your grid or tier 3 distribution costs and have a backup with solar. We've looked at offshore wind, near offshore wind. And the reason for this is that we have vast, 1 minute to go to make it quick. We have vast resources of onshore wind and a lot of land available. Offshore wind has a role to play, no doubt whatsoever. And so from our point of view, we've looked at how could you connect to a grid exit point and -1 supply point and still have really good nearshore wind. And we're not discounting offshore wind at all. What I would say is, so far from the work that we're doing, we're really close to industry. We have reduced our regional emissions through a decarbonisation path and renewable energy path by 14.8%, which is very substantial for our region. And in all quarters, transport, biogenic methane capture from waste landfills, transport, static energy, and so on and so forth. So, and that takes a lot of grunt and a lot of work with industries. This year, we've brought 75 companies into our decarbonisation pathway. They all have baselines and abatement plans. We have several hundred now in this particular area. That's just the downward trajectory of emissions. Just quickly, today we have 1,200 megawatts of new energy, which is now moving into the third phase of the Transpower approval process within our region. We've had 50 new companies look at wind in our region. We have 99 of our 187 boilers that have been converted to renewable energy, electric and electricity and biomass mainly. And we have 158 of our boilers will in their entirety be converted by early 2026. So they're on decarbonisation pathways. We only have 27 left, and of those, several are committed, but outside the 2026 timeframe. So we're making really tremendous progress. But what it means is that our businesses in our region will have insulated themselves from around $518 million worth of carbon. And if the carbon unit is going to be used, the instrument for decarbonisation of the future, we've got to be very careful as a country, because there are very perverse impacts associated with the carbon unit trade, particularly in productive land areas and so on. We believe that if that instrument's going to be used, New Zealand will lose close to $100 billion in exports annually. So it's a very substantial impact. So just really putting it out there, inextricably linked, renewable generation, demand side, get the demand side right, illuminate the possibilities in terms of renewable energy, and there's chances are you're going to have a really successful outcome. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you. That was a whistle stop one.
Thank you very much. So any questions?
Steve, slightly niche question here, but I was really interested on your comment about the national forests, that that we actually have a law preventing those becoming better managed for carbon sequestration, basically, because we can kill the pests, but we can't help regenerate it. Is that what you said?
Say that again, sorry.
So the native forests,
Yep.
as a carbon sink,
Yes.
the current laws are that we can't meddle too much other than kill pests. So we can't actually replant areas that are in trouble to try and assist that. Did I understand correctly?
Yes. So the Conservation Act doesn't allow for native forests to be planted within national park areas as a carbon and be counted as a carbon sink. So this is a very bizarre quirk of policy regulation law that needs to be rectified very quickly for New Zealand. Yep. I wanted to point out too, we've got we've got a stellar woman in the state with us today from our Synergy. 10,000 homes converted to warm homes in our region. So we're very proud of that. That's awesome.
I'm interested in how we're building impact evaluation into the planning of transitions.
Yep. Yeah, look, there's several things that we need to recognise, and that is that this transition does tax people from their thought processes and so on. And so impact evaluation obviously is a critically important part. In fact, both impact and the value created by these investments, and including environmental degradation, has to be fundamentally part of the deal. But our biggest challenge mostly is that people like to be able to turn their lights on, start their milking machines at 4:30 in the morning and rah-de-rah. But the reality is they don't actually like renewable energy all that well. So we, as a country, we have to have a paradigm shift in that regard. So yes, I think you're from Otago University. You're not? No. Okay. Yeah. Well, one of our team is focused primarily on this area, and I'm quite happy to have a chat to you about that. Yep. Yep.
Quick question, if I may, and this is probably to both you and Jonathan. So I guess what I was wondering about was, often if you're trying to do something on a national level, things just get too big.
Yep.
And the country often can't sort of decide to go down a particular pathway. Do you think there's a particular advantage, I guess, starting transitions regionally and using that sort of model as a way of undertaking transitions more nationally?
You've asked the wrong person. I would say absolutely. You've always got to have a global context. You've got to have a national perspective. But if you don't really know what you want within your region, then you're going to get what you're given. And that's not a pathway that is tenable mostly. And we have to be responsible for our own emissions, for example. There's no point in saying, oh, it's somebody else's problem. It'll never get addressed. And likewise, we have to take the energy challenge and the decarbonisation challenge by the horns. And we make no excuses. We have our biggest emitters around the table right from day one, because they're going to make the difference. Sorry, Jonathan will have it better. Yeah.
Look, I've always seen what Steve's doing in Southland as a great exemplar for the country. And my question to you, Steve, is are you seeing other regions actually see what you're doing in Southland and emulating that?
Oh, look, I would say that we have this most days we have inquiries from other regions, mainly just seeking to understand how best to tackle this stuff. Like Ariake, you know, we've been, and this is not our first rodeo, so you know, if we could share this, you know, we've got one planet, so not a test run. Our measure is actually empowerment. In everything we do, and the companies that we're involved with, sure, we understand how to deliver programs and do all that sort of stuff, but actually we want them to be able to take action. And this is an area that is critically important. Information sharing in this space and knowledge sharing is critical for our country as an export region, as an export country, but actually for the quality of life of our people. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, we'll have to move on to the next speaker. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so our next speaker is online. Mike, are you there? Mike, are you online? He's not there.
Okay, kia ora everyone. We'll get started with the next session. So we've got an interesting lineup of speakers talking about national issues in New Zealand. Our first speaker today is Simon Arnold, and Simon wears a number of different hats, and he's involved in various projects to sort of bring innovations and commercialize them. But today he's going to be speaking to us on behalf of NERI, which is the National Energy Research Institute. So Simon, over to you. Thanks.
Can I just check that that it's telling me I can't start sharing my screen while other participant is sharing?
Okay, we'll sort that out.
Thank God for technology. Anyway, just a word or two about the National Energy Research Institute. For those of you that don't know, it's essentially a membership organisation. It's got the majority, I think, of the institutions that are doing energy research in New Zealand, CRIs and universities, and it has as associate members the major business organisations that are involved in energy matters. And earlier in the year, well, over the course of the last year, we had been concerned that there is a lack of applied research funding in New Zealand for the medium term. Research needs, and what it needed was some kind of overarching top-down view of where those priorities lie. And so we set about a process of developing this research framework for addressing New Zealand's energy greenhouse gases. We called it From Fossil Fuels to Local Renewables. I wanted to just draw out, I'll quickly take you through the content. Those of you that can have read it can all snooze off. But the important thing I wanted to bring out was if you're thinking about the future, how do you think about it? and how do you think about research in that context? So I just double check. Am I meant to be trying to share my screen yet?
I think we're almost there, Simon. Sorry about that.
Okay.
You should be able to share now.
Okay, give it a go. You're going to see all kinds of rubbish. Screen. Apologies for this. Are you getting that now?
Just getting your video at the moment. Oh, it's coming through, I think. There we go.
Hi. Okay. So that's all under control then. So just as I do it, I said I would just draw out some points. General points about this is it's applied, it's purposeful. You know, you've got a goal, and in that you need to understand the context to which it's going. You're doing investment now for an environment that won't, you know, the results tend to be multi-year. They're not going to come out till the 2030s and things like that. So you've got to think a little bit about what's material, what's the big stuff, because the little stuff will just be noise. And you also want to think about what's the system going to look like in 10 years' time, because it definitely ain't going to look like it's looking now. And so there are a couple of disciplines. The other thing is that applied research contributes to managing uncertainty. So you really are interested in where the uncertainties lie, and you get stuck into what's clear cut. And where it's not clear, you want to develop options, invest in options, understanding the options. And also the other thing is to increase the adaptivity of your system. So if you don't know what's coming, you want to be faster on your feet than if you do know what's coming. So with those initial comments, I will see what happens if I do that. So the overall target we set for ourselves was, well, the government had set that as the target, which was getting to net zero by 2050, and starting to have a look at the context in which we're doing that today, looking around. Energy sector produces 45% of our greenhouse gases, and fossil fuels supply 3/4 of our energy needs, but generate almost 100% of our greenhouse gases. So looked at it in that light, it's really all about addressing fossil fuel use. And just to have a look at where it gets used, I think we all know this, but it just is useful to remind, you know, transport's over half, industry is about 20%, energy is about 20%, but those numbers were taken at a time when we had the refinery going, so it's dropped a bit, and the rest is about 10%. So in fact, greenhouse gas or fossil fuel use is pretty much concentrated in a couple of areas of our economy. And so what can we do about that? Well, we can think about clean alternative fuels, we can cut demand, or manage the emissions. And so those are the sort of things that we had focused on. And as I said, you want to address the hard and uncertain problems. Takes time, and the priority are the big issues. So it's a medium-term perspective you want to take on it. We want to think, therefore, about addressing priorities. Who are we using fossil fuel by 2035-ish? And how do you get a measure of that? Well, we used a couple of ways. We used time spec, do projections. There's quite a lot of projections. And the MFE greenhouse gas abatement curves, we were looking at what is currently expensive to abate and used that as a guide. I would say, if any of you are interested in techno-economic analysis, that's a useful piece of work, and I would encourage you, for more work to be done on that, so you can understand where the problem, what are the high-cost areas that we need to address, and therefore where we should be focusing our investment. So what's left standing? Heavy land, marine and aviation. I should say that in this analysis, we've included international bunkering and fueling for international air and sea, because even though they're not in the ETS, the respective bodies, ICAO and IMO, putting on pressure on and doing that, and they are strategically important to New Zealand as a remote country. Interestingly enough, we've given the good work that we've heard from Southland and Taranaki, really you only end up with methanol, steel and cement production are the only industry requirements, because most of the thermal loads can be converted to fossil fuel, from fossil fuel to either electric or biomass. Electricity isn't the electricity system isn't a problem, like he said, and probably have a riot on my hands in the room, but it would be down to about 4% fossil fuels, even with the necessary significant growth in demand. But we do need significant growth in other clean fuels. And in that regard, I talked about, this is a figure taken out of the publication, you can see. You've got to think about the system and what the boundary issues are. And there is a bit of a habit of everyone. You talk about electricity, energy, and then you suddenly find that people think they're talking about the whole energy system. Well, as I said, in the case of greenhouse gases, it's not that where the problem lies. And in fact, we're going to see, I think we will begin to recognize that biomass is going to become a significant player and be regarded as a key resource in New Zealand. And we're fortunate in that we've got a temperate climate, and we are doing, we are growing what are regarded as renewable forests, sustainable forests, and therefore they can be used like that. So that diagram is there to sort of try and map the system as a whole, and so you don't get caught in the trap of ignoring what's happening on the other side of the boundary. You chase clean electricity to the nth degree, not recognizing that there's an alternative in clean gases from biomass or something like that, which could handle those. I just draw attention to the fact that we've got impacts, that even if you look at that as your system, there's the box down the bottom, which is equally important. What we've done there is sort of highlighted the areas where we think that the need for research is really in the bio, really in transport. I haven't mentioned, but of course, demand side is a very powerful mechanism. Substitution of fossil fuel travel or transport, reducing the demand for it. Clean electricity is there because, despite what I've said about it, it's going to have to grow, and particularly, the light land, probably the heavy land in New Zealand as well, high duty cycle stuff, and possibly getting into aviation and some sustainable aviation fuels is going to require clean electricity. And there are, as I've said, significant impacts from those developments. So the answer is what you've all been waiting for: how to reduce demand for long-haul fossil fuel transport. And there are a number of things there that are listed. I won't go into it. I would just stress that in each case through this, there are opportunities for New Zealand. I note there, low-cost virtual tourism as an example. Develop clean, low-energy industries. If you look at the industry base we've got that we all wring our hands over, it's a consequence of historic resource endowments. Now we have food, which is pretty much a result of good growing conditions and everything like that. But if you look at what a lot of our heavy industry is, it was based on the, we've got natural gas and things like that. What industries in the future are going to be, they're equally going to be shaped by a shifting set of endowments, and clean electricity, renewable electricity is an important area. And so I think we will naturally see a progression to much more of our energy intensive industries being lightweight, things like, data centers, AI is going to drive a huge increase in those areas. So I think don't get caught in the trap of trying to solve too much our existing industry's problems. Think a bit about what the opportunities are given New Zealand's emerging new resource endowments. We've got to work out what we're going to do about long-haul land transport. And we don't know really better batteries and charging, electrofuels, hydrogen or biofuels or fossil fuels for, carbon capture and storage and things like that. I must say that even in the last 6 months, I think the electricity option for trucking in New Zealand, I think it's getting a head by our nose. What we forget is that we're not North America or Europe, and we have Cook Strait, and our trips are not all that long. And some of these trucks that are coming through, electric trucks that are coming through, looking pretty good. And we've got to de-risk the supply of clean fuels. And that's obviously the electricity supply, but also the biofuels. And I think that potentially biofuels will be an emerging industry in New Zealand. And then there's the, social, economic, cultural impacts that need to be part of that all the way through. And I think that's all I had to say.
Great. Thanks very much, Simon. A really interesting overview. And I think we just got time for one question. So I'll bring the microphone over.
Hi, Simon. It's Janet here. Nice to see you.
Hi.
I'm really struck by your presentation of the research needs as being highly technologically focused. It's like we can kind of drop in new technologies for the old ones and life will continue as usual. But even the two presentations from Malcolm McCulloch this morning and also from Elizabeth Wilson point out that actually it's not so much about new technologies, but about systemic change and incredibly complex socio-political, technical, cultural interactions that are actually the big challenge, not so much the technologies. I'd just like your perspective on that.
Yeah, I hadn't really intended to give that. It's just in that quick overview, you know, that I had tried to stress that what goes on, you know, the other influences over the system have to be as important. I mean, in the end, we use fossil fuels because people want to use them, and if we want to change that, it's got significant impacts on our social and economic and environmental situation. So, not really intended to be more an issue of brevity rather than any particular view. Having said that, I do think that we don't want to get ourselves trapped into the thing of saying it's all too hard, and therefore we end up with Onslows and things like that. I think that issue of materiality and focus, I mean, well, in the end, what we're trying to do is to get rid of, the point of what I'm saying is that in the end, we're trying to get rid of the use of fossil fuels or to mitigate their emissions, and that is a sieve or a lens that I think helps simplify problems.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, we better move on. I apologize. I realize that there are other questions out there, but we'll have to leave them for now. So sorry about that. Can you please join me in thanking Simon again? So our next speaker is Greg Sise. So Greg is a stalwart of the energy scene in Dunedin and nationally. So I'll let him take over.
Well, while we're waiting for those, I'll just say thanks, Sarjan, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm talking today about a research project we've been running for a couple of years, starting to get some interesting results. So I'll be presenting those in the second half of the presentation. Brilliant, thank you. So as a company, we work with a lot of generation developers or would-be developers, and you'd be staggered how many there are out there wanting to build new generation in New Zealand at the moment. But they come to us usually with a consented project, and the next stage for them will usually involve some financial modelling, talking to financiers and investors, and hopefully getting to a final investment decision and financial close, after which they'll go and build the project. So we get involved by providing them with, amongst other things, forecast. And these forecasts are project specific, so location, technology type, output profile, etc. And they're always the average price for a quarter, or sometimes in monthly, and certainly annually. So we run lots of scenarios in our models. At the very least, they'll have 92 years of inflow data from the hydro lakes and 40 years of wind and solar data as well. And they might have more. They might have gas price variations, carbon price variations, et cetera, But what our clients are interested in are the average prices, and that's very significant. So we'll come back to that a lot. And what we do in our forecasting is we, first of all, work out a build or a build out of new generation over the forecast period, which is typically from 15 to 30 years. And we do that by simulating the market using our market models. And then we look at the new generation that's been built. Has it earned its target revenue? Has it made its target return? Sometimes they make too much. We have to take a bit of generation out, and then we'll rerun the simulation. And we keep repeating that process until we've got a converged build, at which point all of the new generation will make its target return on investment. But if we add one or more stations, one or more generators won't make any money or won't make enough. So that's a process that we'd expect to take a few iterations typically. But we've run into some concerns lately, because as we get close to 100% renewables, RE, so I'm talking here above 95%, we find that it takes longer and longer to converge to get stable average prices out of these models. So instead of a few iterations, it could be 20, 30, 40, or even 50 in one case. And the other thing we find is that we get an annoyingly persistent amount of scarcity pricing. And this occurs when there's a shortage of generation during a period. And we model at the 3-hourly resolution for this modelling. So we get a $10,000 price for 3 hours. Now that does contribute to the average price, but it means that customers haven't been supplied. And as you probably realise, that's not something that customers and politicians on their behalf are very keen on. So we have this sort of nagging problem of unstable average prices and persistent scarcity. And we think that as far as our clients go, this will lead to potentially more conservative financial modelling. So because of the volatility in the average price, they will start to look for a higher return. They might delay their builds or build in smaller lumps, if you like, smaller projects. And part of that will result in more scarcity, and a result in higher prices as well. So those are two outcomes that we'd prefer to avoid if we can. So our research question is, can the energy-only market, and I'm sorry I don't have time to sort of roughly describe how our market works, but it's an energy-only market, can it deliver cost-effective new generation and a secure supply at the same time as we get close to 100% renewables? Now, just a quick note here. Some of you will be thinking, oh, but these generators will get power purchase agreements, PPAs with fixed prices. Yes, they all want those, but the longer term ones, which most of them want as well, reset the price after typically 5 to 10 years. And what typically happens there is that they'll reset against electricity futures prices, which are based on expectations of future average spot prices. So even on a PPA, you can't get away from the spot price, which is what we're modelling, if you hadn't picked that up already. So we're interested in 4 key measurements. One is delta S bar over delta G, which is the change in the average spot price for a given change in generation. That's the key one we're interested in. We're also looking at the impact of demand side response. Now this is dispatched, which means it's bid in at a price. It can set the price, and it will only be cleared and the demand is curtailed if it's actually dispatched based on those prices. We're also interested in scarcity, which we somewhat euphemistically call supply of last resort. So that's these $10,000 price periods, but it could include, say, emergency generators at hospitals if it needed to, just as an example. And finally, we're also looking at demand elasticity, and this is demand reduction, which is not dispatched in the market. So this will occur when there's a dry year, for example, large consumers on the spot price start to reduce demand, or if the lakes get low enough, Transpower will be asking us to make voluntary savings. So we include that in our modelling as well. We've set up 4 different market scenarios. So we've got a base case, which is 95% renewables, and that includes just over 900 megawatts of fossil fuel gas-fired peakers, offering in at the modest prices of $217 up to $677. Okay. And then there's 3 100% renewable scenarios. Now, one is what's commonly referred to as an overbuild, where we just keep building wind and solar. There's no peaking plant. There's no major storage. Hopefully that wind and solar and some geothermal will cover the dry years and periods of peak demand. And then we've looked at 2 pumped hydro scenarios. Most of you will have heard of Onslow, which probably won't get built now that the change in government, but that's 5 terawatt hours of storage in central Otago with a 1 gigawatt capacity for generating and pumping, and a smaller pumped hydro in the North Island, 10th of the size storage-wise, but the same capacity. That was on the cards potentially a couple of years ago, but it also seems to have died. And the other common assumptions are forecast demand from 2040. So we're looking at sort of 46 terawatt hours. Jeepers, the time pressure's on me. HVDC link upgraded for the Onslow option. And then we've got 9 scenarios for demand side reductions and 2 scenarios for changes in that generation build out plus or minus 50 megawatts. So between all of those, there's 76 scenarios for 2040. So let's look at some results. First of all, by price of that demand side response, this dispatch demand. So what we're seeing here is that the lowest average prices are achieved with the lowest price demand side response. It gets used more because it's lower price, obviously. There's a bit of a hiccup with that scarcity, which seems to be more common with the lower price demand side response. That's a bit odd. We'll come back to that. And we get less demand shedding with the lower price demand side response. Let's now look at that scarcity, and it turns out that it pretty much comes down to the overbuild scenario. That is well and truly ahead of anything else in terms of interruptions to supply. The pumped hydro ones do really well compared to the base case. So you can see that there's more scarcity with the lower price demand side response. And what's happening there is, in order to lift the average price enough to bring on more generation, we're having to have more scarcity events along with that lower price demand side response. Now we'll have a look by the amount of demand side response available, 400, 600, 800 megawatts. And what we see there is that the more demand side response we've got available, the better the outcomes across the board. Okay, so reasonably clear picture there. When we look at the sensitivity of the average price to generation, delta S bar by delta G, it's a little bit more complex. So we've got all of these reference to the average price in each scenario, because the prices do vary quite a lot by scenario. So the base case is down around 0.2%, and it's higher when you take generation out of the market, lower when you put it back in for fairly obvious reasons. And then we're comparing the other 3 scenarios with 100% renewables to the base case. So the overbuild is higher, between 13% and almost 100%. And then the pumped hydro is much higher, which was a real surprise, because adding pumped hydro reduces the price volatility for any given build out from period to period. But what's happening here is you're adding a huge amount of extra capacity into the market, which is being priced based on everything else that's happening in the market, rather than, for example, a fuel cost for a gas peaker. So that's why you get these very large sensitivities for the average price. Okay, so what are the implications from all of this? So first of all, if we want to stabilise average prices and de-risk investment in new generation and help to minimise scarcity along the way, and that non-dispatch demand elasticity, then what we need to do is develop lots of dispatchable demand side response at low prices. That's pretty obvious. Or another way of achieving that would be to add in thermal generation that runs on sustainable fuels like green hydrogen, etc. That's pretty obvious. It's not quite as obvious with scarcity, because adding lots of storage appears to reduce scarcity, which is great, but it potentially will lead to less stable average prices, which could have that impact on the developers that we talk to and make them more conservative. I'm conscious that I've raced through that. It took me a long time to get all of that data condensed down into something that was presentable in 12 minutes.
Great. Thanks very much, Greg. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Greg. Awesome presentation. Just a couple of questions. One is noticeable change in industry in particular as users of energy is that they are looking more at shedding load, obviously efficiency front end, shedding load, no longer requiring N-1 supply. So, you know, you're ultimately using less energy. But the question I have is, how does your modelling change if you have a firmed energy supply? So if you're if you already produce, say, hydro, and you're looking at wind or solar or a combination thereof, do the economics change when you have firm supply, because you can enter into supply agreements with greater certainty of being able to supply, you know?
So by firming, do you mean what we've got now with lots of fossil fuel thermal generation available?
No, more particularly around hydro and hydro. Yeah.
So it does depend a little bit on how much pumped storage or other storage you've got on a large scale.
Yeah.
Obviously, but assuming that we don't have large scale pumped hydro, then say the overbuild scenario, the lakes have to run higher, run fuller, you get more spill. So that potentially does, or the reason for that is that they need to be higher so that they can get through winter, which is the critical period. So I guess that does provide more opportunity for that firming that you're talking about. And in fact, in that overbuilt scenario, really the hydro plus any batteries that are installed, for example, are the only real peaking plant available. So in some ways they have to do it.
I think the other question I would ask is that if you look at the top 5 generators, hydro generators in particular, their short-run marginal cost of generation and even their long-run marginal costs are 0.1, 0.5% per kilowatt hour. And by the time we buy it as an average consumer or a small industry or business, you know, the markup is somewhere between 2,500% and 3,500%. Have we built an industry in New Zealand that just is outpricing itself? Is it too complex for the needs of this country, you know? And how I know I'm not suggesting for a moment that be disestablished, but it does seem rather over the top.
Yeah,
kind of created Max Bradford kind of model that's talked about competition, but it's not really competition.
Probably deserves a long answer, but I mean, the short answer to the hydro part of your question is that if you don't price stored water correctly, then you'll end up either with continual shortages or continual spill. So water and storage is priced using or based on opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost at the moment is primarily established against the offer prices of thermal generation. As that thermal generation shrinks and as a percentage of the market, it's increasingly based on things like demand side response, but in a price scarcity prices. And this is really where the problem starts. And as I said before, I just really emphasize this: if you don't get that opportunity based opportunity cost-based pricing right, you're just going to be misusing your water. So it's really important that that's done correctly. And so I hope I'm not taking up too much time here, but if you want some really good evidence of how important this is, look at MBIE's pricing data that they release each year and have a look at the wholesale cost of electricity and the wholesale cost of gas and see how closely they correlate. Gas drives water effectively.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I know there are a lot more questions in the field, but we'll have to stop for now. So thanks very much, Greg, again. Okay, our next speaker is Celia. Welcome, Celia, once again, and we'll get your slides up.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Celia Wells from GNS Science. I'm here to talk about decarbonising primary industries with geothermal and how the primary industries is a pathway to greater direct use within New Zealand. There we go. The first thing I'll say is that we're very good at geothermal electricity generation within New Zealand, but we don't actually use geothermal or the heat from the ground directly all that well. I just want to get this pointer working. Yes, great. So this is sort of indicating some of the trends that we're seeing in Europe at the moment with the investment in using geothermal heat directly. Now this is being used for district heating, for aquaculture, horticulture, and agriculture. GNS did an event with the German embassy the other day, and I learnt that Munich is on track to have 85% of its heating for districts converted across to geothermal. Now, those that have been to Germany probably haven't seen geysers and boiling mud there. What they're doing is drilling kilometres to access temperatures of 70 and 80 degrees, and those are temperatures which are accessible at quite more favourable depths within New Zealand. So you can see that there's $7.4 billion of investment expected from 2022 into 2030, a real ski jump there. Of course, Iceland is a big contributor of the graph here, but there's not massive growth. It's actually these other countries investing in the lower temperatures, which is really interesting. And I guess I'm here advocating that New Zealand needs to consider following this trend as well. So essentially geothermal energy is everywhere. This is a diagram that we have transferred across for New Zealand applications. When I talk about direct use, what I mean is you are using the heat directly. So if you are, for example, a glass house and you need 70 degrees, you're wanting to draw out of the earth approximately 70 degrees, maybe slightly higher, and then you can lower it down. So that's what direct use is about. We've got sort of milk processing factories, 2 of them in the North Island, which are accessing very, very high temperatures for their processing. But just a reminder, I'm talking about lower temperatures here today. So the other term we use is indirect use. That's when you're getting these sort of lower temperatures, feeding that into a ground heat exchanger or ground source heat pump to elevate it to the temperature that is required inside a facility. So ground source heat pump is the term that we use there. And there are a lot of applications within the primary industries. This diagram, the more colourful one, is one that's put together specifically to New Zealand temperatures. This one here has come from IRENA. What you can see here is you can do dehydration, milk evaporation, wine industry, aquaculture down here, lots of different applications directly. I've modified this for a recent exercise that we did for ECA. We were involved in the regional energy transfer for the Bay of Plenty. Geothermal was included as a work stream for the first time. What we did is we were able to look at some of their ground temperatures from ambient around 16 degrees in the North Island to geothermally enhanced, so up to 40 degrees. feed that into a ground source heat pump, and feed that into a ground source heat pump that was actually achieving industrial delivery temperatures of 150 degrees. So that's where we're getting, it's getting exciting. We can do all this type of work with relatively mild ground temperatures, and actually the technology is looking like we can achieve some of this work as well. Some heat flow maps that have come from GNS. As you can see, there are the expected high temperatures are in the Taupo volcanic zone, but there are actually favourable temperatures in many parts of the country. So just moving ahead because I got the 5-minute mark a bit early. And we're doing further mapping here where we're looking at actually the favourability of the aquifer for using ground source heat pump technology. So in the Netherlands, the horticulture sector there is drilling sort of this example here is drilling 2.5 kilometers to access 70 degrees to run this capsicum facility. And they're really committed to using geothermal. So their Dutch geothermal strategy for their greenhouses has very significant targets of transitioning across to geothermal at significant capital investment. Drilling 2.5 kilometers is not cheap, but it's a reliable source of energy for an industry which is well established because of its reliance on cheap gas within that country. So they had to find a reliable transition. So our covered crop growers are looking to the Netherlands for what they're doing, and they've come to GNS and said, where is the geothermal resources that we can use to transition? Because we're getting hit by ETS costs. Natural gas, coal users, as you can imagine, I'll just skip through that. There are alternatives to biomass, full electrification, or geothermal. Pluses and minuses in all these situations, depending on the geographic location that you are. But the benefit of geothermal is that there is no more efficient way to heat than with heat. I'm going to focus on this one because I've realized I moved really quickly over those last ones. This is the work that we did for the recent RETA exercise for the Bay of Plenty. What it shows here is a greenhouse facility which was 3.2 hectares in size. We converted it from gas to an air source heat pump. That was the coefficient of performance. Where it is located, it is sitting above ambient groundwater, so on average about 15 degrees. So in comparison to the air source heat pump, the ground source heat pump had a higher coefficient of performance. You can see that the electrical input is decreasing, price is decreasing, savings are increasing. What we did was we moved it across to Tauranga, where it's really it's not too challenging at all, and a couple 100 meters to access 30 degrees, and look what happens to that coefficient of performance and incredible savings. So this is a really exciting opportunity for industry if you can access those types of temperatures. I said at the start that this, working with the primary industries, as we are working with the horticulture industry within New Zealand and MPI, is a pathway to greater direct use. This is from the Dutch geothermal strategy, and what they have done is they've started with the greenhouse sector because it is they've got urgent needs to transition, but what they've noticed is that or what they're forecasting is that geothermal use will convert across to the urban environment and then to industry. This figure here of 30 petajoules, which they are on target for in 2030, in New Zealand, our electricity generation from geothermal is 30 petajoules. So that gives you some indication as to the extent and size of the horticulture industry within the Netherlands. It's quite remarkable. When it comes to, this is my last slide, when it comes to the low temperature geothermal and its role within the energy trilemma, low temperature geothermal is a reliable, renewable. There are no emissions associated with it other than the what you're using from the electricity grid to operate a ground source heat pump. When it comes to geothermal, if you're not releasing steam, you're not releasing any carbon emissions either. I've talked about the affordability. We're looking at a district energy scheme which will have savings between 30 and 50% for heating of your home when using ground source heat pump. So there are massive potential social savings there, and these systems are paying themselves off in 2.5 years, which is quite remarkable. And lastly, from a security point of view, the efficiencies We're reducing peak load. There's efficiencies for the grid. If more applications were actually looking to use ground source heat pump, if they can, if it works, as opposed to just going straight for the electrification. I hope that I made that point okay in the end. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Celia. We have time for one question. Jared.
Hi, maybe very basic, but is there any seasonal variation on the temperature gradient or the depths that you dig? Avoid any type of like lower temperatures in winter or in rainy season?
No, the short answer is not really. No, like if when it comes to the ground, it might be sort of one degree or something. It's where the greatest efficiency comes from is that you have a reliable source of temperature feeding into your heat exchanger as opposed to the variation that you get with air source.
Okay, that's a really interesting talk. Thanks, Celia. Once again, thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Juan Cabrera. So Juan has come to us from Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Thanks, Juan.
Thank you. Buenas tardes, kia ora, welcome. My name is Juan Cabrera. I'm a master's student for the program of renewable energy at Victoria. And today I'm just going to talk a bit of what has been my research over the last 3 months about applications of agrivoltaics on agriculture New Zealand. Just a little start, like what is New Zealand targets about renewable, reaching net zero gases by 2015, a target of 50% renewable consumption by 2035, aspiration target 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Alongside with this, NBA have some goal sets as energy affordability, source security and reliable energy, and energy system that can support economic developments and productivity growth. As a part of my research, a recent generation investigation for Electricity Authority shows that a commitment for 2,000 gigawatt hours of generation, gigawatt hour year, 28,000 gigawatt hour year are being actively pursued, which amounts to more than 11.5 gigawatt hour installed capacity over the next 2 decades. Transpower projection for solar generation is setting up by 2015 a target of 9.3 terawatt hours. We are currently sitting around 0.5 terawatt hour. Utility scale ground mount solar requires a large amount of land. Literature review shows that roughly around 1 megawatt DC requires at least 1 hectare of land of fixed tilt system, and for tracking system around 1 and 1.6 hectares. How we can achieve these targets with the amount of land required to get to these targets. One solution could be the applications of agrivoltaics on New Zealand. New Zealand has an agricultural land of 11.26 million hectares, 40% of New Zealand total land area. is allocated to agriculture. Just talking a bit more about defining what is agrivoltaics. We can define agrivoltaic as a combination of energy production by means of photovoltaic system and agricultural production on the same area. The Fraunhofer Institute defined as a potential 90% increase in productivity of the land. Some another research say the farmers that can achieve an increase of 50 times of their profit. Now, I just want to define the different types of agrivoltaics. We have 3 different configurations. Overhead PV panels, which normally they are located 2.1 meters on top of the crops, or interspace PV, which usually are vertical with biophase panels, and PV greenhouses, which we can check the PV stray or PV checkboard. As a part of my research, trying to achieve New Zealand targets on moving to renewable energy, one of the things agrivoltaics came across as a solution for the land use. It's been a lot of research on what is livestock, horticulture, sorry, I just a bit nervous. These definitions, looking at the literature review aspect, what has been done overseas, we have most of Europe has been checking the Fraunhofer Institute about the APB guidelines. Another one I was having a look was solar power Europe's, which agri-solar best practice guidance. With this, the objective of the research was looking at all those different applications of all the different configurations applications of agrivoltaics, how this one can tailoring on New Zealand context. It's like I say, it's been a lot of research on the livestock. My focus was about horticulture. Horticulture in New Zealand is defined as they have like 80% 10 millisector and sorry. Horticulture in New Zealand. It was the focus on my research. Horticulture have 133.549 hectares of land, annual value of 6.87 billion, a total export of 4.6 billion, domestic of 2.27. And for my case study, viticulture is separate from the numbers on the whole horticulture. Checking our New Zealand crops, we can define eight different top crops value, which are kiwi fruits, apples, onions, cherries, potatoes, tomatoes. Just talking a little bit what the literature reviews say about the different application of these high value crops. You can see for kiwi fruit, one of the PV greenhouses is one of the best application. Beet fruit overhead PV panels. Potatoes as well, they have overhead. Thank you. Overhead panels. Tomatoes. Find interesting what the last picture was telling about the tomatoes and the gases. On the research I was doing tomatoes, one of the best configuration was PV greenhouses. Also, quite interesting to see the different applications for different renewables. Viniculture, the overhead panels. One of the benefits of the overhead panels on the viticulture application is a reduction of the panels that create a microcline on top of the grapes, which reduce water consumes, create shade for the grapes, which also on the grapes helps to reduce the sugar content, which this is one of the problems the sector has been facing with the climate change. The rise in the temperature change the sugar content on the grapes. So it's one of the current problems the industry is looking at. And just like a quick conclusion, agri-PV could help on to achieve the targets for the net zero. Thank you. Sorry.
Right. Thank you, Juan. And I think that's a really fascinating concept. So thank you for sharing that with us. I have time for one question if anyone has.
Yeah, just a quick question, and it perhaps doesn't relate to what you're doing exactly, but there's quite an expense in the structures of getting those panels above the crop.
Yes.
Is anyone looking at the possibility of covering all the roofs of the packing sheds, the cool stores, the animal shelters, all the other stuff? There's plenty of flat space already above the ground that perhaps could be used instead.
Well, for what I can see on it's been doing on livestock was yes, it's been done overseas. It's been done mostly for sheep, just because they are less complicated than, for example, cows. I believe they have more problems about the cows just rubbing against the panels or things like that. But yeah, I guess on this case of the application of agrivoltaics over the land is more like having the use of both, like the land for keep going with the agricultural practices and the generation of solar.
Okay, please join me in thanking Juan again. All right, our final speaker for this session is Jen Purdie. And while we bring up her slides, Jen is a resident researcher here in University of Otago, looking at modeling the electricity system in New Zealand and probing various interesting scenarios. So I'll let Jen go into that in more detail.
Thank you. Well, kia ora koutou, everyone. I'm going to talk to you today about industrial demand response in the New Zealand electricity system. And this is the work done by May Robertson, an honours student that Michael and I supervised this year. So this is her work. She couldn't be here to present it. I'm hoping she's listening online and that I do it justice, May. So she did most of the modelling for this work. So just an overview, I'm going to present 4 questions to you here, and this happens to be the 4 modelling scenarios that we used. So the first question is, what's a likely middle of the road picture of electricity generation out to 2050? That was our base case. What happens if we build a few big industries in New Zealand, put that big new load on the electricity grid, and then build some wind and solar to supply that load? What happens to the system? What then happens if these new big industries offer demand response to firm up the intermittency of our 100% renewable system after the mid-2030s? And then what say we retained, instead of putting that demand response on, what say we retained a few gas peakers instead for firming? So just looking at these 4 scenarios and the implications of those. So first of all, our base case, this is just one scenario. I do a lot of modelling with a lot of different scenarios. This is one potential future for the New Zealand electricity system. This is national annual generation for the next 30 years and what it's made up of. You can see a couple of things that we go from 43 terawatt hours currently to about 63 terawatt hours in this scenario, but some other people's scenarios see a doubling of electricity demand. The black dotted line is percent renewable, so you can see that we get to 100% renewable by the mid-2030s, and that's just quite a natural progression with the closure of old coal and gas plant. And hydro plays a big part in this. So you can see that wind in green and solar in yellow grow prolifically in that time. The black is thermal, coal and gas plant, and that dies away. And the grey and red are demand response in batteries, and that's needed more and more as we get more intermittent. And so the current hydro that we've got is quite good at firming up the intermittency, or along with the thermal plant. But when we have a dry period, we have to come up with about 5 terawatt hours from somewhere to cover that dry period. So what are our firming options for this intermittency? So our current hydro storage plays a part, although we're not expecting to build much more hydro storage because people aren't keen on flooding valleys anymore. We could overbuild renewables, and this means that we build 10 wind farms in the hope that one of them might be generating when we need the power. The problem with that in New Zealand is that we're so small that everything's highly correlated. So if it's blowing somewhere, it's blowing everywhere, and if it's calm somewhere, it's generally calm everywhere. That's not quite true, but generally true. Hydrogen and biofuels are going to play a small part in firming, but I don't think it'll be a large one. Batteries are good, but they're generally only good for hour to hour or day to day, possibly within week. They're not so good at shifting load seasonally. Pumped storage is good for that, but our new government has said they're going to get rid of the idea of the Onslow pumped storage scheme. And what we're left with then is perhaps demand response. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm sure everyone here knows what demand response is, and it's been talked about a little bit already today, but just a quick summary. So this is a daily profile of electricity demand in New Zealand with 24 hours along the bottom. You can see the morning peak and the evening peak. If we wanted to have some wind farms and solar farms that were just going to supply those peaks, then they would have to sit around idle for the rest of the day. So the idea is that we bring those peaks down by turning a few things off, and that's demand response. This can be residential. Hot water heaters are excellent for this. If they're well insulated, they can turn off for an hour over the evening peak and nobody cares much. Heat pumps can be turned off on at 4 p.m. rather than 6 p.m. That's helpful. And vehicle to grid batteries are going to be used a little bit too. Cool stores are already used. Transpower has deals with cool stores to turn off if they have grid congestion issues, and they don't mind because they're well insulated as well. And other industries will potentially be important, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The model that I use is LPCon. It's a model of the New Zealand power system owned by Meridian Energy. It's got a spatial resolution of grid exit point, temporal resolution sub-weekly, so I can look at peak and off-peak periods going out 30 years. It goes out to 2050, and it's got 89 years of hydrological and wind data for every hydro catchment or area. As Greg's already talked about, demand response is offered in at a price and volume like negative generation. If your wind is offered in at $80 a megawatt hour and your demand response offered in at 100, then the wind will be called on first, and then the demand response will be called on after that. May went through and looked at the arrangements that are already being made by industry around demand response. Tiwai Point has already spoke about in media what they're willing to provide. They'll knock a pot line off 50 megawatts, but they need notice. They have ramp downs and ramp up periods. NZ Steel will provide 30 megawatts, but only morning and evening peaks in winter. And you can see there that our national load is somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 megawatts, to put that in context. These are the four scenarios that we looked at. So base case was what I've just sort of shown you. Industrial demand case added 1.5 gigawatts of demand. That was Tiwai Point staying open to 2050, Southern Green Hydrogen, a big plant in Southland, and a bunch of data centres, which are already being advertised as potentially arriving in New Zealand. Then our third case was take that industrial demand and get them all to offer demand response. And the fourth case was don't get them to offer demand response, but keep a couple of gas peakers on instead. Couple of things here. In the demand response case, we offered 350 megawatts of demand response, and in the gas peaking case, we had 350 megawatts of gas peakers, which we kept on instead of closing down. And in the demand response case, we offered the demand response in quite a lot cheaper than in the, so there's residential demand response already in the base case. We added this sort of big lump of industrial demand response on top of that and offered it in a bit cheaper, so it would be called on. You can also see that the keeping a couple of gas peakers on doesn't change the percent renewable targets hugely. Instead of being 99.9% renewable by 2033, we were 99.3%. So there's a good argument for keeping those on. So the results, first of all, I looked at how much new generation was needed to be built in these cases. Firstly, before we put this new industry on the grid, we were going to need about 3 new west wind farms a year. I don't literally mean wind farms, so there would be all sorts of things, but that gives you sort of the size of the prize. And then when we added the new industry, we now needed 7 west wind farms a year. Industrial demand scenario without any firming needs overbuild. So an extra sort of 13 to 20 wind farms were needed for that scenario compared with the firmed scenarios. The big question that these industry will want to know is how deep for how long are they going to have to turn off? So what we found with the amounts that we put in there, which were what they have said they will offer, we found that in the demand response case, 15% of weeks in the 2040s had some DR dispatched, but often it was quite small. It was only the 10% wettest years that had no demand response dispatched at all. The 90% of driest years all had some demand response. The maximum volume of demand response dispatched was 1 hour in the 2040s where 830 megawatts was dispatched, which was 12% of load. So 12% of the country's load, that would be like turning off Tiwai Point. That's quite big. In that instance, there were dry hydro lakes, cold temperatures and high winter demand. The longest continuous run of demand response dispatch every hour was for 3.5 months. And that was the same extremely dry period. Hydro inflows well below average for months, hydro storage lowest on record. And the maximum annual dispatch was 742 gigawatt hours. So if you compare that with that 5,000 gigawatt hour dry year whole, it helps a little bit. Looking at system efficiency, the firming scenarios had much less spill. So of course, spill is you're throwing away wind or water and not generating with it. So we don't want to do that if we can avoid it. But you can see that the 2 firming scenarios, that's the demand response and the gas scenarios, there wasn't much difference between them and the amount of spill that they had. If this is shortage hours, a shortage in gigawatt hours, sorry. So this is the period where the system was under great stress, was quite significant in when we put that big industrial demand on, but sort of solved itself when we brought in either demand response or gas. And it is important to remember that the industrial demand scenario used quite a lot of batteries. So you have to firm it with something. Batteries are expensive and difficult. And so, but we had to use something to get that industrial demand scenario to work. System costs, I'm going to flick through this really quickly. In fact, I'm going to zoom through it. The biggest cost is the building the generation plant to supply the new demand. After that, better firming makes costs cheaper, but there's not a significant difference between our 2 firming methods. And in summary, so industrial demand response could be a good tool to help us with firming renewable intermittency. And several big current or proposed industries in New Zealand seem open to offering this. The maximum volume of demand response dispatched was in a dry, cold period with high demand, where 830 megawatts was dispatched, and that was 12% of demand. The longest duration of continuous demand response dispatch was 3.5 months, which occurred in the driest period on record. Both the demand response and gas peaking firming options had lower spill, lower system shortages, and lower system costs than the scenario without firming. Demand response scenario and the gas peaking scenario did not greatly differ from each other in these system efficiency measures, which was implying that they have sort of similar costs and benefits. And the model does have a carbon price in it, so there would have been higher carbon prices for the gas scenario. Given that retaining gas peaking keeps our carbon emissions up, but demand response requires curtailment of productivity, it would seem that a sort of portfolio approach would be the way forward. And the maximum DR dispatched was 742 gigawatt hours just from these 4 industries, showing that DR could go some way to helping us fill that 5,000 gigawatt hour dry year risk hole. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jen. And we've got time for 1 or 2 questions. I want to ask if there are people online who have any questions. Okay, we've got Robert put up his hand. If we will ask you to unmute and ask your question, Robert.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert McLaughlin from the Massey University. Yep. So conveniently, my question is on your very last line there. Doesn't that last line mean that there is still a potential issue with storage that needs to be looked at more closely before this whole scenario can move forward? How are you going to fill that hole?
Hi, Robert. Thanks for your question. Yes, absolutely. You do have to remember this was just 4 industries, but there is a huge trade-off. You could say that the industries had to have renewable energy built to supply them. Therefore, that brought in greater intermittency, which they then solved by providing demand response. So it is a bit of a circular argument, and the devil's in the detail. Yes, but residential demand response is not factored in here, and that could be even bigger than this, I would say. But I don't think it's the whole answer.
If this whole DR system was brought in, how would that affect the industry's willingness to invest? Would that support their decision to invest in the first place?
That's a good question. I don't know that anyone would have the answer to that, actually. I think it will definitely impact it. But we've probably got problems with investing enough to double demand anyway.
Yes.
And so this is just a part of the big equation, I think.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions online? Any other people? Okay. Questions from the room?
Hi there. From what you were saying, it looked like battery storage was a very valuable thing, even in the dry years, because you only really were needing it for an hour or two now and again. But that hasn't really been modelled very much or talked about in this country.
Yeah, I think it's batteries are very inexpensive solution, but also only very good for sort of shifting within the day or within the week at the most. Whereas when we get a dry year, we need that long continuous stretch of use. And so you could invest in enough batteries to give you 3.5 months of demand response. But yeah, you are. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think it's the cost that is quite prohibitive, and the volume of batteries that you'd need and whether you could get them. But yeah, I mean, I think, and I reiterate that the second to last line there, I think a portfolio approach, we need a bit of everything, particularly if we're going to not build Onslow.
Okay, we'll have to draw close to the questions there, but let's thank Jen and all of our speakers for this session. We'll move on to coffee and tea again. So we're starting back at 1/2 the hour. And if those of you in the next group of speakers could come and load up your presentations.
We're going Andy first. We're swapping 2 people. Which one? So Andy is first, and then Wilson is third.
Kia ora, everyone. How good have some of these presentations been, hey? I don't think slide envy was a thing until I came here. So myself and Juan, who spoke earlier, are 2 trimesters into our masters, with Alan Brent up at VUW. My background is predominantly as an electrician, with some time spent in fisheries compliance, working for MPI. My undergrad was in sociology and policy and marine biology. So what I'm going to attempt to do today is cover what my research has been in surrounding gravitational energy storage, and kind of plays into the demand response challenges that we're going to face as we lose grid inertia. How's this bad boy work? Here we go. So what I'm going to try to do as well is see it through the sort of legislative and cultural and social responsibility lens as well. So up here we can see that we've got Resource Management Act enabling investment in the wind turbine offshore wind sector, as well as the New Zealand Battery Project papers that are looking to address some of the dry air security issues. So we all know we're blessed with a pretty awesome country, with a lot of, our EEZ is about the 4th biggest, with approximately 18,000 kilometres of coastline and 425,000 kilometres of waterways. What's going to be important as we go through this transition is that we realise and address all our obligations to te tiriti o Waitangi, as well as that Article 2 specifically. So here are the trajectories as proposed by Transpower in Whakamana i te Marihiko document, which outlines how we're going to work towards our global and domestic goals of 100% renewables. Who's lost the pointer? That bad boy there. As we can see, hydro is going to stay relatively flat. We're going to see an approximately 17.5 increase, terawatt hour increase in wind, and approximately 9 terawatt hours of solar. The majority of that will be taken up with electric vehicle charging, or electrification of the transport industry, as well as heat process from industry. So if we break that down, just looking at wind alone, we're going to need to see an increase of 583 gigawatt hours per year, running from back at 2020 through to 2050. Here's a couple of plots. This was used to analyze a dry period in February this year, where the thermal plant up in Huntly was fired up with Indonesian coke and coal to distribute energy back down across the HVDC link. It identifies the vulnerabilities that we face in New Zealand through just having hydro down south as the main integrated provider of energy to cover demand, as well as the fact that we required or needed to fire up thermal in the North Island to send down here. What we can see in this instance is the curve. What happens here is there's obviously demand that changes throughout the day. In gravity energy storage, these systems leverage off a process called arbitrage, which means that they generate the power when the price for it is low and sell it when it's high, in a nutshell. I went M. Night Shyamalan on this. Fuck, 5 minutes. I'm just going to go through. This is a taxonomic rank of gravitational potential energy. I was going to boost through here. There's a cool little video here. Rail systems. It's not yet commercially used commercially yet. Up the top's part of my research is just comparing a few different topologies of gravitational energy storage, and they're projected just on the paper, not my calculations, what they see or claim their megawatt hour claims to be. I'm going to charge on through, team. Energy Vault, the only one that is commercially available at the moment. The crane type is one of their first models. The building up here is currently being commissioned in China. So they've obviously addressed maybe factors like wind, changing crane operations or hindering them. Right, going through to gravitricity. The awesome thing about this is these guys are upcycling or recommissioning abandoned mine shafts to drop weights down. It's really interesting and could be applied in New Zealand if we perhaps research some of those West Coast mines and use the rail system. What it can then do is bring value to maybe communities that have had infrastructure shut down. Right, moving along. I divided my research into wet and dry because they both have different round trip efficiencies and are both in different developmental phases of their, I guess, technological maturities. Some of them are used with wet, predominantly ancillary services to drop curtailment of offshore wind. Here it just shows the differences between operating in saltwater and freshwater based off the density. As the temperature drops, so does the salt content. And as the depth drops, the pressure does. So at 3,000 meters deep, the air that would usually be 1 kilo on the surface is now just over 350 kilos. This is one of my papers that I checked out. This formula here basically is just the volume, the pressure density of the seawater in the air, minus the mass, gravitational constant, and efficiency. I'll keep moving. Geez, my mouth is dry. Bassett et al., which is probably one of the coolest projects, has a really cool process and operates at 100 meters to claim 1 megawatt hour of energy. The best thing about it, which would suit New Zealand, is it's modular. So it's made up of multiple buoys as opposed to one big rigid system, which would clearly require extra infrastructure to install. These are my efficiencies that I ran of the 60 papers that I looked over. I found about 21 with efficiency information. I just ripped it all out and used pumped hydro and compressed air as good little sort of markers to compare the wet and the dry with. Efficiency can also be seen as that profit margin that you can gain more out of when you're using that arbitrage process as well. So as mentioned earlier, I can't remember, tightening the screws on efficiency can have massive positive financial effects. Here, I did the same with the LCOS and the energy capital and power capital. This was the curve, as alluded to by Jen, of the wholesale price of electricity as it changes throughout the day. Therefore, if you can make it while the price is low down here, sell it up here, job's a good one. Here we've got power capital for pumped hydro and the compressed air systems. Reasonably mature technology. They're a lot lower than the newer proposed technologies. So we could assume to see these sure up over time. How am I going for time? Am I way over? Sorry, everyone. I'm new to this thing. Same with the levelized cost, although I must admit there was very small pockets of data to find on the more mature technology, so a little bit more research into this would be awesome. I'm just going to shift on. So some of the recommendations, I think, due to the time sensitivities and our obligations to the Paris Accord and our aspirational goals domestically, beginning to look into some of these dry gravity energy systems with quick response times to start to organize or help out with frequency control, voltage regulation, peak shaving, all that kind of thing could be a good start. And then obviously work into the wet gravity energy storage systems as they mature with the technology. And maybe just mention how good the oh, I've gone too fast. We can go back. No. Just how cool the how relevant the Mortensen paper was to New Zealand with the upcycling of topologies or industry that has maybe been abandoned, or where we could potentially look to upgrade and bring some value back to regions with new energy systems. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. That was really interesting. We haven't got any online questions, so anybody in the audience like to ask a question?
So just wondering, what was the highest round trip efficiency that you saw, and also what timescale can they store energy on? So is it like, can they store it for months or?
Yeah, good question. So the highest claimed round trip was a wet gravitational energy system with air transfer between modules, and they claimed 95%. That's still new tech and hasn't been commercially developed. So with the wet GES, a lot of the claimed outputs are based on lab findings, obviously just because of the maturity. The Energy Vault system claims around 80 to 90. Some of those losses will obviously depend on the technology and you know, losses through the gearboxes and other mechanical losses, but it's, by all accounts, these GES systems look to be more efficient than traditional gravitational storage like pump hydro. In regards to the release time, it depends on the depth of the system. The underwater wet GES, slower moving just because of the drag coefficients and the mass or surface area required to make it. But these, if they're deep enough, they can be discharged over months. I mean, we're talking 10 millimeters a second over however deep you want to put it.
Thanks, Andy. I think we'll have to leave it there, but can you join me in thanking Andy again? And next up is Sam Caldwell from Vector, talking to us about load forecasting for dynamic operating envelopes.
Kia ora. I'm Sam, data scientist at Vector. Thanks for having me here. Just a quick show of hands, actually, who's done any load forecasting or energy forecasting in the room? Oh, actually, quite a few. I'll try and cater to both crowds, but might maybe neither. Let's see how we go. But in the context I'll be talking to about load forecasting today is bus charging in Auckland. We have 2 bus depots connected with charges in the last year, with 7+ more sites to come in the next year. We are using this as a proof of concept to develop DERM systems or smart charging systems. DERMs might mean different things to different people, but in this case, at least we have our bus stations are connected to existing HV feeders that have existing customers on them, maybe residential or commercial. And then in this case, our DER is our bus stations or the chargers on at those bus stations. And then those existing customers on the HV feeder have a sort of a base load. And then we say to the bus stations, they can have the residual load underneath that capacity or the headroom. Because they've connected to an existing HV feeder, that means that they don't have to build a new one. They're just given kind of use of an existing asset, and that saves them very large upfront capital costs. And which of course being at Auckland Transport, that would be socialized, savings for that would be socialized for the ratepayers. So the operating envelope in this case, so we have the capacity of the feeder, and then the what's left over after the base load is what we give them as their operating envelope. So that's the maximum that they can charge throughout the day. Where it's dynamic is that obviously that base load changes depending on things like the weather. And so that at a higher base load, we give them, there's less headroom to give them for their operating envelope. The challenge with this is obviously we don't know that base load in advance, so we need to forecast it. And that load varies according to different factors like public holidays, the weather, what day, week, month of the year we're in, different customer types that are on that feeder at the moment, and their behaviors, and then a degree of sort of randomness as well. And then we're not only kind of making a mean estimate of the load, but we need to put in a buffer, I guess, for error, and that error comes from firstly the model, but then we need to make a kind of allowance for that, depending on our tolerance for risk. How that risk sort of works in this case is that if we forecast underneath what the load actually turns out to be, the operating envelope is based off that prediction. And so the bus depots will charge based off that prediction of what's left over of the headroom of the feeder. And then if we add together the actual load that they saw versus the actual charging, we might see that the load goes above the capacity of that feeder. And that's a headache for our control room teams who are there to need to protect our assets from overloading. But it also means that might mean that they have to step in, turn the bus depots off and then that prevents them from charging. The buses don't get charged for the day, and then you see a familiar sight to Aucklanders with cancelled bus routes the next day. If we over forecast the actual load, again, the bus is charged based on what's left over of that forecast. And then we end up, once we add the actual load with the envelope, with the actual charging, we've left with this headroom that we didn't use up. And so that means that the customer's not happy. They could have charged more. We had unutilized assets. And then sort of in the long run, you might see that prevents them from flipping their fleet over to e-buses in the long term. So in summary, we're trying to make a forecast with enough error estimation that kind of captures all of our actual load. And then what's left over after we add those sort of buffers is what we offer up to the bus depots as their operating envelopes. So you can see here that what I just said. So the more accuracy that we have in our load forecasts, the less buffer we need to add on top of the forecast, and that leads to better optimized operating envelopes. And that leads to better outcomes for all. So good forecasting saves the world. How that happens in practice is obviously we internally collect load data on our feeders. We also collect from AT their bus charging data. So from the previous day, we combine that with weather data from NIWA, and then obviously calendar holidays. We combine all of those data sets, clean them up, throw them to an algorithm, and then stand up that algorithm to predict the next day ahead. Some challenges with that. On the top left, that blue line is what we measured at our feeder. The grid, are they flipped? No, the green line, sorry, is the bus load that we got from AT. And then so what we're trying to forecast is the difference of those two lines. So the line in red, when we did that differencing first off, the time scales were kind of offset. So you got this added noise from there. Other challenges was that the feeders switch loads between each other. So we need to exclude when that's kind of switching has happened. And then also we measured load before AT started sending their bus charging data, so we could see some charging activity, but obviously didn't have the load to difference that, so we kind of need to exclude those points as well. Again, I guess the challenge with forecasting here is that we're not just like the errors kind of often, if you're forecasting the mean, would kind of cancel each other out in these cases. But because we need to forecast the error as well, all of our data points need to be, you know, real data points. So we need to be careful with removing all those outliers. More forecasting challenges. This is kind of going to be stood up as a system amongst other software systems being built. So we need it to be fast. It needs to be accurate, as I've already explained. We also want to be able to provide our planning team with explainable forecasts. So not just a number, but how we kind of get to that number, which rules out a lot of kind of black box methods. And then we need it to be flexible enough to work across all the different assets with different customers on as well. Forecasting algorithms, we are leaning heavily on the open source softwares, so that the big tech companies all offer up algorithms. They spend millions on time series forecasting and kind enough to open source that. Also, the programming language is open source, and with all the packages that we can get to help with time series forecasting too. You might be asking, my car drives, AI drives my car for me. Why can't you just throw this at AI? Machine learning for time series forecasting is kind of finicky, and a good kind of pulse check of that are these M competitions where you forecast things for money. They're open competitions anyone can enter. We saw only up until recently that machine learning models started winning those competitions, and even then they need to heavily lean on the statistical methods to ensure that what they got out of them was still accurate. Won't spend too much time on results, but because it's ongoing, but results so far are somewhat promising with explainable forecasts, but again, need to lean more on those statistical methods and checking to do more fine tuning. So the conclusion, as we've seen, DIMS can enable large cost savings to our customers. If the more accurate load forecasts are input into those DIM systems, it can lead to better optimized operating envelopes. And that forecasting is finicky. Reason why I still have a job. The data needs to be prepped carefully, and it's not what algorithm, but kind of how you use it. I'll open for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Fascinating. I did quite a lot of forecasting myself in the past, so I find that really interesting. Any questions from the floor?
Sam, I might have missed it, but how many feeders are involved and what determines their capacity?
So there's two sites already with feeder each, and then it's not fully certain at this time. It's kind of 7 to 10 we're looking at, and the capacity is it's a whole thing, but there's a nameplate capacity on those feeders, but it changes a lot with heat. So the summer and winter capacities will vary, but then also the previous loading. So I didn't go into that, but if you can overload them a little bit, but then there's like residual heat in the feeder, and then so eventually that capacity drops as well. But yeah. I'd have to ask the engineers. Yeah. Not sure.
Sam, do you have any sort of error score or explain variance, mean absolute error, anything like that?
Not yet. Not yet. Sorry. Yeah. Good question though. Soon to come.
Anyone else?
Just wondering, do you need to do a whole year? It would seem to me that just winter is the key season to look at, or I mean, given if you've got residential and commercial buildings, you've got going to have your highest demand. I don't know, maybe it's Auckland, so
Yeah.
maybe this is not true, but then also your buses, often they're you know, if they're heating during the day, then the electric bus demand would also be higher in winter.
Yeah, yeah, true. It yeah, as a previous question with the numbers of feeders, they're quite different depending on what customers are on those feeders. And it depends, yeah, like how close they are to that capacity. And then I said as well, the summer winter problem with the actual capacity of the feeders themselves. So the capacity will drop over summer. And so the envelopes kind of get tighter naturally, even if there's less base load on them. So yeah, kind of need to consider all of them, but it will be summer, yeah, like in your case, some feeders maybe winter's kind of the main important part of time.
Cool. Any other questions? Now join me in thanking Sam. Right, our next speaker is Wilson McNeil from the University of Canterbury, looking at electricity demand and offset emissions from nationwide heavy battery vehicle electric versus fuel cell truck decarbonisation in New Zealand in 2050. Lots of words. Great. Wilson, thank you.
Well, hi there, everybody. So my name is Will, and just a little bit of background about me. I am a PhD student over in the United States, actually, at University of California, Berkeley in the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I'm here for a one-year research stay through the US Fulbright program at the University of Canterbury. Now, we've heard a little bit today about heavy trucking, and that being one of the hardest sectors to decarbonize. So hopefully with this presentation, I'll help to answer how can we do that. So this presentation is titled Electricity Demand and Offset Emissions from Nationwide Heavy Battery Electric versus Fuel Cell Truck Decarbonization in New Zealand in 2050. So road freight or trucking is responsible for 93% of freight by tonnage and 75% of freight by ton kilometer in New Zealand, which is much higher than many other countries like the US. It's only responsible for around 6% of total vehicle kilometers traveled, yet it has a disproportionate amount of emissions, a quarter of on-road carbon dioxide emissions. In a now famous study, Health and Air Pollution in New Zealand, or HAPPENS, transport was found to be responsible for 2,200 cases of premature mortality in New Zealand annually. These are due to air pollutant emissions. Also responsible for over 13,000 cases of childhood asthma and greater than $10 billion in social cost every year. And of those damages, diesel vehicles are responsible for 82%. So heavy trucking specifically, of the 3 billion vehicle kilometers traveled from freight trucking, over 70% is due to heavy trucks, which are greater than 10 tons. Now, the Ministry for the Environment published Aotearoa's first freight emissions reductions plan, and they noted that freight emissions should be reduced by 35% by 2035 and reach net zero by 2050, which are pretty ambitious targets. But we need to see how we actually reach that. Now, we're looking at two competing technologies for heavy truck decarbonization, and those are battery electric trucks and fuel cell trucks. Now, a little bit of background on integrated assessment frameworks that have looked at health and climate impacts of battery electric trucks in places like the US and China. Both of these places rely, at least in some part, on fossil fuels for electricity. We haven't seen a study looking at truck electrification in a highly renewable grid like New Zealand. There's also been a primary focus on battery electric trucking, we haven't seen as much, or it's not as common to see a nationwide analysis of fuel cell trucks or comparison between different technologies. And also there's been a focus on 100% truck electrification, sort of hypothetical scenarios, since a lot of countries don't have the same targets of New Zealand, like reaching net zero by 2050. Now we can see in this image on the right, this is from some of my previous work on the US, that the climate impacts of battery electric trucking heavily depend on the renewable regional energy system and how much renewable energy is in the grid. And therefore we need regional heterogeneity in where these battery electric trucks are charging. So research gaps include the electricity load of battery electric versus fuel cell trucks, also comparing battery electric versus fuel cell trucks specifically, also in New Zealand with a highly renewable grid and based on specific policy targets. Now this led me to the following research questions. What is the energy demand for battery electric versus fuel cell truck decarbonization in New Zealand? How do freight emissions reductions targets in 2035 and 2050 affect this demand? And what is the contribution of trucking to air pollutant emissions? And how will the penetration of zero emission trucks reduce these emissions in the target years? Now, we developed this integrated assessment framework, beginning with traffic monitoring counts, and then using diesel truck emission models to determine on-road emissions of greenhouse gases and air pollutants. From those heavy truck flows, we look at battery electric trucks and fuel cell trucks. We consider many complexities of the design, the truck design, battery capacity, design, and weight, whether it's confined by a vehicle weight limit, charging power, and increasing efficiency from 2035 to 2050. I'll get into more detail on each of these factors on the next slide. For fuel cell trucks, we also look at truck design, hydrogen storage, refueling rate, the vehicle weight limit, and increasing efficiency. Now, from each of these two technologies, we develop a hourly scale load curves under 4 different refueling scenarios. We're looking at those policy targets of 2035 and 2050. And we look specifically at different regions, and we assign loads to different regions. Now, members of my research group at University of Canterbury are just weeks away from completing a capacity expansion model. And this will help answer the question of how much capacity do we need to build out to meet the additional demand by battery electric versus fuel cell trucks, and through what technologies, and where do we need to build this capacity, and also what will be the impact on fuel costs. Now, for the battery electric truck design, for the truck design scenarios, we look at a couple different aerodynamic truck design scenarios, base case, pessimistic, and optimistic. Similarly, for battery design, which has an impact on weight. For battery size, we vary between 0.5 to 2 megawatt hours, charging power from 500 kilowatts to a massive 4,000 kilowatts. And we look at with and without a gross vehicle weight limit if that impacts load. And we look at all these different efficiencies, and we consider how these efficiencies increase by 2050. Now, on the fuel cell side, we look at those similar aerodynamic truck design scenarios. For storage, we vary between 10 to 100 kilograms of hydrogen, refueling 2.5 to 5.2 kilograms of hydrogen per minute. Vehicle weight is based on literature, either between a 1 to 2% increase over diesel trucks. We look with and without a gross vehicle weight limit. And we look at all the efficiencies, a different set of efficiencies for fuel cells, and we consider how they increase from 2035 to 2050. Now we look at 4 different refueling scenarios. Now, previous research has produced load curves similar to what we see on the right, and these are based on how diesel trucks operate. But battery electric and fuel cell trucks might operate slightly differently. They might charge overnight and be ready to go in the morning. So we're looking at 4 different scenarios, totally distributed evenly over 24 hours, then one with overnight charging, one during solar hours, and then one similar to what we see on the right with refueling throughout the day and similar to diesel trucks. Ultimately, what we'll be able to show is how the electricity price varies in each of these 4 scenarios after the capacity expansion model is complete. Now, here's the first set of results. So New Zealand generated around 43,000 gigawatt hours of electricity in 2021. Now, for a full fleet of battery electric trucks in 2050, it would require 3,100 gigawatt hours, or just over 7% of current generation. Now, for fuel cell trucks, these generally have a lower efficiency. And so in 2050, it would require a full fleet of fuel cell trucks would require 5,800 gigawatt hours, or 13.5% of current generation. Now, that's a pretty significant change, considering right now trucks require 0% of electricity. And by 2050, we could see up to 14% of current generation having to go to electric trucks. So we need to think about what capacity needs to be built to meet that demand. Now, here's the 4 different refueling scenarios that we looked at, and we broke down the hourly load by region. So Auckland and Waikato had the highest demand, followed by Canterbury and Otago. And what we're interested in is if distributing this load would have a big impact on fuel cost. Whereas if we have a distributed just during solar hours, for example, there's a much higher peak. Now, we conducted a sensitivity analysis varying these different factors to determine what has the biggest impact on load. For both battery electric trucks and fuel cell trucks, the aerodynamic truck design scenario had the biggest impact on total load, with an optimistic or very aerodynamic truck design having the potential to significantly reduce electricity demand. For battery electric trucks, battery size and battery design both had an impact on weight and then overall electricity demand. Whereas for fuel cell trucks, the potential efficiency is still so uncertain that that has the potential to increase or decrease load. Now, onto emissions. We estimate that currently currently diesel trucks are producing 2.4 million tons of CO2 equivalents every year, but that has the potential to be reduced by 2035. And then assuming the targets of 100% by 2050, if we meet those emissions reductions plans, that could be 0. Additionally, we need to look at these air pollutant emissions, so fine particulate matter, or PM2.5, and NOx. So these are thousands of tons of emissions from diesel trucks every year. And this has, as we've seen from the HAPPEN study, a big impact on health in New Zealand. So it's important to consider these emissions in addition to our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, a discussion of this work, there is a significant electricity demand to decarbonize heavy trucking, between 7 to 14% of current electricity generation. And this is only for heavy trucks. So there's going to be additional demand from electrification of light and medium duty vehicles. So New Zealand will need to build significant renewable capacity to meet this increase in demand over the next several decades. However, improving truck design and efficiency can reduce this electricity demand. And finally, it's our recommendations that air pollutant emissions should be considered in freight emissions reductions targets due to the impact on public health. Now, future work. So as I mentioned, in progress, we're working on capacity expansion modeling. So this will answer the question of how much capacity do we need to build out to meet this additional electricity demand, and in which regions does that need to be built? Also, what will be the impact on fuel cost? Future directions for future work should consider technological improvements like regenerative braking, also mode shifting to easier sectors to decarbonize like rail. New Zealand also has additional targets for reduced emissions intensity of fuel. This isn't something considered by this study, but should be considered in future studies. And finally, the targets for emissions reductions are currently for on-road emissions and specifically domestic emissions, but perhaps there should be targets for life cycle emissions, considering battery manufacturing. And if the electricity is coming from fossil fuels, what will be the power plant emissions? So that should be considered in future work. And I'm going to leave off with some acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the Sustainable Energy Research Group, or SURGE, at University of Canterbury, specifically Dr. Rebecca Peer and Dr. Yannick Haas, and PhD candidate Rafaela Canessa, who's working on the capacity expansion modeling. Funding for this work came from the US Fulbright program, and there's my contact email below. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Wilson. That was really interesting. Any questions from the floor?
Have you done any research into the technology where batteries can be swapped out for charged ones and then the old batteries charged off peak? And if you have, yeah, could you tell us about that?
I have not studied that. I am aware of the technology, and I think it's a really interesting possibility, especially for keeping operations similar to how we refuel diesel trucks, that it could happen a lot faster. The other thing is to consider is that current battery electric trucks are able to recharge quite quickly, I think more quickly than initially thought. So maybe it might not be as much of an issue. I would say we're going to have to wait and see, since this technology is still so new.
On that note, you talked about the sort of annual load on the grid by 2050. Have you looked at all at different charging patterns, when trucks charge, how often, what time of day, that sort of thing?
Yes. Yep. So for the long haul recharging scenario, so that's based on current dispatch of diesel trucks. So basically diesel trucks leaving in the morning and recharging throughout the day. So that's what that scenario is based on. It's based on not having to switch around schedules too much, whereas the other ones we're looking at like overnight charging or charging during solar hours, and we'll be able to show whether one of these would be significantly better in terms of fuel cost.
All right, sorry, I missed that. Any other questions? Thanks. Okay, well, join me in thanking Wilson. Our next speaker is Evelyn Hunsberger from Vector, looking at new methods of low voltage outage detection for facilitating the energy transition.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. And congratulations on making it this far into the end of the day as well. I'm Evelyn, and I'm on the same team as Sam at Vector. I'm a data scientist there. And I'm going to be talking about the new methods of low voltage outage detection for facilitating the energy transition. So we're all, I'm sure, aware of the nuisance of outages in our daily lives, but as we become more and more reliant on our electricity, it's going to become more of a problem as we start charging our cars, as we start relying on electricity for heating and even communicating. So outages are going to become the risk of outages is becoming higher. So that's why we've been doing this research. So separate to the problem of preventing outages in the first place, this research is focused on identifying them so we can respond as quickly as possible. And obviously, Vector does have methods for detecting outages, but sometimes the ones at the low voltage level do slip through the cracks. So I'll explain why that happens in a minute. So this focus is using existing technologies that are already installed at household levels, and then using data analysis to kind of identify where those outages are occurring. So back to the big picture and the energy transition, we all know that means increased electrification, increased reliance on the grid, and the requirement for increased reliability. And for Vector, part of that means identifying the outages as soon as possible, which is going to require this low voltage visibility. So what is the status quo of how Vector currently detects outages? I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this picture of how the grid works with going from left to right. You have the generation and then the high voltage transmission lines, and then you drop in voltage again, and then eventually get to transformers where the voltage drops again, and then it feeds into homes and businesses. So Vector is responsible for this green dashed line. And today I'll be talking about this space here, which is the low voltage level. And if we zoom in even further, this is going to give kind of context of how some of those outages sneak through the cracks. So again, moving from left to right, we have things like the zone substation, and then you have high voltage lines going to transformers, and then low voltage lines going to our customers. And if we have a high voltage fault, then what happens is that we get an automatic detection that that's occurred, and we know that all of these customers don't have electricity. But again, if we have a low voltage fault, what happens is that we might not know about it. So what we have to do is rely on customer calls to inform us that there's an outage at that level. So what we're trying to do is prevent customers from having to call us so we can preempt these issues. And how we're doing that is using the existing technologies called meter ping and ONT. So first I'll explain what they are, and then I'll go into how they work and how we're applying this to our daily operations. So meter ping uses a connection at the electricity meter, and we have about 30% coverage of our network, and that's mostly due to the providers of the data, but also some technology constraints. Some of the limitations of that technology are the time. So we are limited by how many pings we can send just limitations. And the costs are slightly more limiting than ONT because it's a bit more expensive. On the other hand, we have ONT, which stands for Optical Network Terminal, and that is a connection via the fiber modem. Coverage is slightly higher. It's almost 50% of our network, and that's mostly in the urban areas of the city. One of the limitations of ONT is the accuracy, because we get hundreds of signals each day. And so we have to filter that data heavily to actually identify the outages. And instead of one of the other limitations is that it's a passive technology, so it just sends us signals when there are changes instead of us targeting households. So how do they work? With meter ping, we'd send a signal to a household or a building that has the technology, and then if we receive a response from that building, then we assume that the household has electricity. But if we send a signal to the household and then we don't receive a response, then we infer that there might be an outage there. And then ONT, on the other hand, like I said, it's more passive. So basically, if we don't receive a signal, then we assume that if we don't get a notification, then we assume that the household still has power. But if we do get a status change, then we would assume that there could be an outage there. So how would we combine both of these technologies together to kind of have a more comprehensive low voltage visibility system? So imagine you have this cluster of houses, and some have ONT capabilities, and some have meter ping capabilities, and some have both. So then you have a low voltage fault that occurs, and then you get information about a status change from ONT. So then you'd say, okay, we might have an outage here. And then what we could do is that we could ping houses nearby. And if we don't receive a response, then we've sort of confirmed that there might be an outage there. But in addition to kind of confirming the outages, we could determine how, what the extent of the outage is, so how far it expands by pinging other houses in the area. And then if we do receive responses, we've kind of confirmed that that area might not be experiencing the outage. So as this is work in progress, we needed to design several experiments, and for meter ping, that was creating trials to test things like accuracy when we changed the rates of pinging or the batch sizes, the areas. And then for ONT, that was using the data that we had been collecting and applying different filters and testing what was actually giving us information. And in both cases, that the way we checked the accuracy was that we compared it back to our high voltage data sets. And the tricky part here is that we were hoping for a lot of overlap, because that was meaning that the technology was working, but we were also looking for a little bit of misalignment, because the misalignment was going to be that undetectable low voltage outage that we were looking for. But the struggle with that is that sometimes it's hard to tell if you're just seeing data quality issues or if you're actually finding what you're looking for. I'll spend a little time, just an overview of our results, because it can get a bit jargony. But one thing we tried with meter ping was testing different modes to ping. The dispersed was by far the best, so that was kind of spreading them out across the network. On asset by asset, we just went north to south, feeder by feeder, and tested different zones. And then a radial was going sort of like a clock around the network. Another thing that we did was we checked our, we targeted specific areas that we knew were going to have outages, and then we compared our results against that. So here you can see we're getting a bunch of fails, which is good because that's where the when we think the outage is happening. And then you can see the clear restoration of power for those houses when you start getting the successes. So that's great. One of the ongoing challenges with this data set is that there's always sort of an underlying level of fails that we're getting that we're not expecting. So that's ongoing work, but also leads nicely into why it's helpful to have two technologies working together, because we can kind of compare them. So for ONT, this is an outline of the process that we went through. So for a given, this on the left-hand side is showing for one day all of the signals that we were getting. And in order to actually be able to find anything useful, we had to filter out around almost 90% of all of the signals we were getting. But the great news is that when we did that filtering, we started seeing all these clusters. And then here is the best news, which is that we found several clusters where we were getting only data from ONT, where there was no high voltage data there. And then we were able to confirm that that cluster was an outage because we had a customer reporting an outage. So this is kind of showing that it's working how we were hoping. And then how would we use these two things in practice together? Again, filter the ONT data, identify clusters here, and then you think, okay, this could be a potential low voltage outage. And then you could ping the customers where they have the ability to receive those signals. And then we can send, if it returns a fail, and then we have two kind of sets of data telling us it might be an outage, we could go and send a truck there to try and fix it before a customer even has to call us. So going back to the big picture and the energy transition and our electrification and needing reliance and reliability, this has been a proof of concept of how we can leverage existing technologies that are already installed. So it's not as big of a cost as having to install other things to monitor the low voltage network. And so we're just using data and insights to kind of solve a problem that we're facing going forward. Thank you.
That's fascinating, Evelyn. Thank you. Can you tell me, do you know from your results, what proportion of times you would send a team out and find no fault?
Oh, I didn't actually analyze that, but that would be oh well, you mean from our, so this is all proof of
From
concept.
your
So
results.
actually,
Would it be like 1% of the time, or?
We haven't used this yet to send people out. This is kind of in the last few weeks. We've just been like testing it against past data. So it would be interesting to see if we start feeding it to our operations team, kind of what they'll do with it. But we haven't gotten to that stage yet.
Cool. Any questions from the floor?
Yeah, I was a little bit confused about the change of status on the ONTs. Do they stay on? Are they powered up using a battery or something internally during an outage?
So they would require some electricity. So if there's loss of electricity at the building, then they'll send a response that says they've gone off and then the time. So then you'll have that kind of interval where you know that it's probably off. And then when electricity is restored, then it'll send a signal that it's back on again. So you kind of are getting the status change information.
So at the start of the outage, you get a signal to say an outage has started.
Yes. Or yes, but as I show with the data quality, oftentimes, like during the day, you'll get very, very short just switches in status that don't correspond to outages. So you really have to look for those clusters and realistic durations, because we also have some that have been out for several days, but that's not actually reflecting the household electricity.
So for it to send a signal, though, does it have a battery or something? Because if this power has suddenly gone out.
I'm not actually sure how the technology itself. I've been more involved in the kind of analysis of how to leverage it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Thanks. When you ping the meter, is there anything else you can get back other than the fact that it's alive?
Right. There, I think, are other capabilities of the meter, but that would just bring different costs involved. And I don't know if all meters are capable, but I think that is a possibility that we would look into as well, of trying to get other information. Yeah.
Just a really basic question. What exactly is a ping? I mean, is it in this case? I mean, what have you sent down the line?
It's like a cell signal. So over the cell towers would send a signal, and then that would either return a success or a fail on our end. Yeah. No. Yeah, and I should have been more clear about that. So some of the limitations as well are like cell tower limitations that we've placed on us, or not we, but like vector metering and yeah.
Any other questions?
So those optical network terminals, they're what you plug your internet modem into. Correct. So they can be turned off at the wall by the consumer as well, can't they?
Yes,
and
yes.
Also, aren't they owned by a completely different companies? And is there problems with getting that information off the internet and optical companies?
Yeah, so I guess that's why I had the Chorus logo there. So that's